All right, I think we'll get started now. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us today in this discussion on recruitment in the Nepal, Kuwait, and Nepal, Qatar corridors. This webinar is grounded in a report that was recently released by FairSquare and its 5 Corridors project, which assesses how effective both origin and destination states are in ensuring that recruitment protects migrant workers' fundamental rights. I'm Rima Kalush, I'm from migrant-rights.org, and I'll be moderating this discussion. So as many of you know, fair and ethical recruitment is a cornerstone of migrant labor activism, and rightly so. In a world that's increasingly dominated by temporary visa regimes, the recruitment process largely determines a migrant's experiences abroad. So in the Gulf region, where the rigid Kafala system reigns over the lives of millions of migrant workers, the link between unscrupulous recruitment and conditions of forced labor is especially prevalent. The story that we commonly hear is of a migrant worker who has taken out loans to pay off extortionately high recruitment fees, who is deceived about their conditions of work, and lands in an exploitative situation that they are unable to leave because they can't change jobs easily and they need to pay off their debts. This financial entrapment often occurs alongside other dimensions of coercion and control that colors a migrant's experiences abroad. So a graphic that we at migrant-rights.org had published several years ago illustrates this continuity between a worker's experiences at origin and destination. And since then, there has been a lot of attention and resources invested in recruitment, and particularly in the Nepali migration corridors. And what this report and this discussion will provide is an understanding of what progress has been made, what challenges remain, and what obstacles exist to meaningful reform. So to share and respond to the report's findings, we have with us some of the authors of the report, as well as perspectives from civil society, academia, and the recruitment sector. For the sake of time, I'm going to introduce everyone right before they speak. So we'll start with James Lynch and Anurag Devkota, who will be presenting insights from the report. James is a co-director of the 5 Corridors project. He has worked on the human rights of migrant workers in the Gulf for around a decade at FairSquare, and prior to that at Amnesty International. Before working on human rights, James was a diplomat in the Gulf. Anurag is a human rights lawyer at the Law and Policy Forum for Social Justice Nepal, and is a Nepal researcher for the 5 Corridors project. He has been continuously litigating and representing Nepalese migrant workers at the Supreme Court of Nepal. He also teaches law at Purbanchal University and contributes columns on contemporary labor migration issues. So James, I'll hand it to you to continue the introduction and to proceed with your presentation.
Thank you so much, Rima. I'm just going to share my screen and we have some slides. So yeah, so as Rima said, you know, I was a co-director of the 5 Corridors project, and I hope that's all that sharing is working. I just want to quickly, before we'll go into the findings on the Nepal to Kuwait and Qatar corridors, just quickly give a brief overview of what the 5 Corridors project is, so it's clear what the context is that we've been doing this study. These are the 5 corridors that we studied, and Nepal obviously features in 2 of them, in corridors 2 and 3. You know, most of the corridors that we've worked on have been in Asia, and just to give you the sense of why we've been studying those corridors. The idea was to try and enhance the understanding of how governments, specifically governments rather than the private sector, can strengthen their laws, policies, and practices to address abusive and fraudulent recruitment practices. So this is about fair recruitment and trying to identify, well, what are governments doing now with respect to fair recruitment? What is working? What is not working? And what are the steps that we see that should be applied and would have a more effective prospect of delivering fair recruitment from the perspective of migrant workers. And I'm not going to go into detail on this, just to say that these are the 7 key recommendations drawn from all of the 5 corridors. They're available on our website. There is a report and you can see them. They're broken down in various web pages. I'm not going to talk to them in detail here, but just to stress, I think one key element here is that you can see that the top 3 recommendations in priority are all aimed at destination states. One of our the key findings we identified was that destination states, their role is often undervalued, given less weight in discussions about recruitment, given the intense importance of their role and their power within the recruitment process and their ability to regulate employers. Looking at this corridor, just before I sort of hand over to Anurag to present on our findings in Nepal, I guess the first thing to say is, we're going to be presenting highlights. Anurag and I are trying to get through what we found in 3 countries, and we covered in a 160-page report, which is on our website. We're going to try and do that in about 20 minutes. So please excuse that we are going to cover some issues with, a sentence here or there. And we are, some issues that are very important, we may not even get time to mention in our presentation. Hopefully the discussion will allow for us to bring out more depth on some of the issues. But just, I think one thing that's worth highlighting here, and there's a couple of statistics that are illustrative of this, these are corridors where migration is incredibly important on both sides of the corridor for the economies and societies, of Nepal, where a large proportion of families have a relative who is migrating for work. The economic contribution of migrants to the economy is huge. And in both Kuwait and Qatar, the large majority of the workforce are migrant workers. And indeed, in the case of Qatar, for example, that's been part of a significant increase in the population of the country, a sustained increase, which has been driven by migrant workers. And of course, these large proportions of migrant workers within the population can lead to concerns being expressed about demographic change, and that that in itself can then lead to xenophobic attitudes, stigmatization of migrants, and attempts to kind of control the migrant worker force. So these are themes that we'll touch on as the discussion goes on. In terms of what we did, our sort of methodology, this was quite a long process. Particularly, it was slowed down because of COVID-19. We had about at any one time, we always had several researchers working on these corridors. 8 people in total were part of this. And we spoke to migrant workers, many of them remotely because of COVID, experts in these fields who are involved in the migration process, and we spoke to the 3 governments as well in different ways. To try to be comparative, we studied the same 44 indicators for all 5 of the corridors. And these were drawn largely from ILO standards on fair recruitment. We arranged those 44 indicators into these 9 areas. Again, we studied the same thing in Nepal to Kuwait, in Nepal to Qatar, and in Myanmar, Thailand, Mexico, Canada, etc. I won't go into any more detail than this. These are the 9 areas, migration policy, legal framework, and then some really specific issues like grievance and remedy processes and licensing schemes. All the details of that is on our website if you'd like to look in more detail. And we provide the 160-page report goes through each of the 44 indicators for each of the countries. Over to you, Anurag, to start take us through what we found in Nepal.
Hello, I hope I'm audible. Thank you, James. Thank you, Rima, for the introduction. And thank you, James, for setting the context and giving this quick update on the methodology of the research. Before I run down on the findings from Nepal, just to reiterate what James just mentioned, the findings that I'm going to present here might not represent the report or the study in its entirety because of the interest of time. However, it does try to summarize the corridor narrative in a nutshell. So to start on the positive note, the study acknowledges the fact that there has been a noticeable advancement in the labor migration governance of Nepal. in the recent past. Some of these important improvements include a gradual shift on the scope and priorities of the government, where the emphasis of foreign employment has been shifted from promoting the foreign employment towards protection of migrant workers. So some of these evidences are also witnessed in the recent amendment of the laws, where there's been a slight amendment in the language of the law to make it look more protection friendly. A simple example for this would be like the renaming of the Foreign Employment Promotion Board to Foreign Employment Board. So it does pose a sort of a good gesture from the government vis-a-vis the good practices as witnessed in the sector. Similarly, the recent MOUs signed by Nepal, particularly after 2017, these agreements are more right-based, and they do include some solid provision on the protection of migrant workers' right and recruitment fees, as we compare that to the agreement that has been previously signed by the government of Nepal. So some of these agreements comprising of these good practices are particularly the agreement with Jordan, Malaysia, UAE, and Mauritius. So by far, these agreements are some good examples of the paradigm shifts in the labor migration governance, particularly on the fair recruitment side, or at least on the content, although the impact of these agreements are yet to be assessed. Likewise, the advancement and digitization of foreign employment through the introduction of softwares and applications like Foreign Employment Information Management System, FIMS, and demand attestations through embassies or missions. These are some attempts to bring more control and transparency in the recruitment process, which is another good practices observed by the study in this particular sector. Similarly, on the measures to provide accurate information to the workers, which is also one of the 9 indicators of the study, we have found some good practices where range of different print and multimedia resources were made available to the workers. Although these resources were, utilized by the experienced and more educated migrants who are on the minorities. But to fill these information gaps, the resource centers have been established. For instance, there are Migrant Resource Center, which has been established in 39 districts across Nepal. So they have been providing information related services to the workers. Next slide, please, James. With these good practices and advancements, there are still some serious concerns and challenges which have been impediment towards making the whole recruitment process fair and ethical. So one of such significant example or concern raised by this study is that of a partial fee ban. So back in 2015, the government introduced a free visa-free ticket policy. However, as per the policy, the workers could be charged up to 10,000 Nepali rupees, which is equivalent to 83 US dollars. So that was basically in the name of service fee. But the workers that we spoke to, they said to have mentioned that they've paid far in excess to the legal cap. For instance, we found that the workers ended up paying up to 160,000 Nepali rupees, which is equivalent to 1,350 US dollars. So in reference to these evidences, the study finds that there has been enforcement gaps, and the government authorities have not been able to curb down these recruitment related malpractices. And one of the many reasons being the inadequate capacity or the dearth of resources in these bodies of the government. Say, for example, the Department of Foreign Employment, the DOFE, is the foreign employment regulatory body of the government. It comprises of only 4 investigation officers who are mandated to monitor and investigate more than 800 actively operating recruitment agencies. So it stands to be one of the reasons for these enforcement gap is what the study finds. Also, there has been this increasing demand for worker pay model, making it difficult for the recruiters to secure jobs from employers unless they commit to a workers' pay model. So in light with these evidences, in light with these findings, the study recommends the government of Nepal to implement and enforce a full prohibition on the payment of the fees and related costs in line with the ILO definition by migrant workers to the recruitment agencies. Next slide, please, James. So briefly on the domestic workers, a quick background. In 2017, the Parliamentary Committee of Nepal introduced a ban on the migration to GCC countries for domestic work. So on that backdrop, the study finds that these bans unduly affected women and they drove them to opt for irregular channels or irregular migration routes via India by these agents. So the ban kind of exposed them to a greater risk of recruitment-related abuses, and adding to that precarity, they were further deprived of the consular assistances in the destination countries. The domestic workers, they were offered with limited assistance by the consular officials, and these workers, they did not even make it to the priorities of the consular assistance. For they were labeled as those who have cheated the system. However, very recently, the government has lifted the ban, but the preconditions follow, which includes having bilateral agreement with destination countries, and the destination countries should ensure in their domestic laws the workers' rights, including health and safety measures, 24 hours insurance, social security measures, including wages and leaves. So to that findings, the study recommends Nepal to provide women with regulated channels to migrate to the Gulf for domestic work, investing in dedicated gender-sensitive capacities, both in domestic institutions and in diplomatic missions to protect women. Next slide. So coming to my last slide, there are a range of other challenges as evidenced in the study, which incorporates access to justice barriers at home. Take, for example, the centralized complaint hearing mechanisms, which has not been very helpful for the workers in accessing justice, as large number of migrant workers come from outside of the Kathmandu, where all these judicial mechanism and complaint hearing mechanisms are Kathmandu based, or they are based in the capital of the country. So in most of the cases, workers often, it has been found in the study that the workers, they often avoid the complaint against recruiters, or even if they do so, they are forced to accept mediation processes, which often resulted in the lower compensation for the workers. However, on a good note, there's been a MOU signed between Nepal Police and Department of Foreign Employment. So this 2020 MOU between Nepal Police and DOFE, it for the first time gives the police the ability to receive and investigate complaints against unregistered recruiters. And also on the side note, the new amendment in the Foreign Employment Act of Nepal, it sort of delegates the complaint receiving authority to the CDO, the Chief District Officer at the District of Administration Office. This is with an aim to decentralize the entire judicial mechanism. So adding to these challenges on effective remedial mechanisms at destination countries, the consular support has been very limited, by virtue of these inadequate resources, while the domestic workers and those outside of these regulated channels are yet to secure a protection in terms of processing their complaints from the government authorities, especially on the destination countries. So against these odds and challenges, the study, it recommends that Nepal should strengthen the capacity of the diplomatic missions to support workers and ensure that the 2020 DOFE Nepal Police MOU is implemented in its fullest efficacy. Thank you.
Thank you, Anurag. I'm going to move swiftly on to Kuwait and Qatar. Just to say where we highlight recommendations, they are really, we're picking some out for the purposes of this presentation. There are many other recommendations in our report. We just can't fit them all on a slide. So turning to Kuwait, I think it's worth saying as an introduction here that fair recruitment hasn't been a major focus for the Kuwaiti government. And in that light, one of the good practices I want to highlight is the fact that in the last year we have seen more public commitments on this issue. We've seen more of a sense from the Kuwaiti government that fair recruitment and employment, is going to, is something that they are looking at as they look at labour reforms going forward. That's obviously very encouraging. In practical terms, what we've seen is, the domestic worker law of 2015 does have a clear prohibition on the payment of recruitment fees by domestic workers, and that's quite a good ban because it actually incorporates payments made outside the country and to intermediaries, which is something that not every country has in their laws. Enforcement's a different issue, and we'll come on to that. And then the third thing I wanted to highlight as a good practice is, compared to some of Kuwait's Gulf neighbors, there is some space for civil society and others to organize, to represent workers, to support workers, and some limited space for migrant workers themselves to participate in efforts on implementing fair recruitment and employment. Moving on to some of the challenges then, I think recruitment, essentially is something of a marginal concern. And that's reflected in the fact that for non-domestic workers, the law leaves unclear who should pay recruitment fees. And that's a big problem because it essentially means that it would be impossible for a worker to really, under current circumstances, to bring forward any kind of claim against an employer if they have paid recruitment fees other than domestic workers. And I think that reflects the fact that recruitment is very much seen as an issue for origin states, and several very senior interlocutors reinforced that point in discussion with us. And in fact, most of the debate in Kuwait is actually about reducing the fees paid by employers of domestic workers to the recruitment agencies, rather than looking at the fees paid by the workers themselves. The bigger preoccupation for the government is demography. We've seen major, quite dramatic commitments to bring down the number of workers, migrant workers in the Kuwaiti labor market and the Kuwaiti population, and that was something that really became was very much stressed during the pandemic. And obviously that doesn't really sit very clearly and coherently with Kuwait's development plans, which involve expanding sectors that actually require a large number of migrant workers. So there is an incoherence, and it also with such a strong government narrative on the need to Kuwaitiize and remove migrant workers from the population, that is obviously helping to feed xenophobia and discrimination in the broader population, and that is a serious concern that came up through our study. I also want to just flag here the Kafala system in Kuwait is strict, and it is a very restrictive version of the Kafala system compared to others in operation in the Gulf, and that's obviously the principal means of controlling the migrant workforce, and has a significant undermining effect on any fair recruitment efforts. Domestic workers, was a big theme of our research on Kuwait, and some of the, the labour reforms that have taken place have tended to be, in the field of domestic work, and perhaps that's because Kuwait has faced most public scrutiny over this issue, both internationally and nationally. There was been some very high-profile investigations, such as by the BBC, and a major bilateral crisis with the Philippines after the horrific murder of a domestic worker in 2 to 3 years ago. Domestic workers play a hugely important role in Kuwaiti society, And the 2015 law was a positive step, an acknowledgement that Kuwait needed to bring its laws closer in line with international standards. But the implementation of that law has been lacking, and our research very clearly indicates, both through conversations with workers themselves and those that support them, that women continue to work extreme hours, that they may face physical and sexual abuse. Anna Bunda is here, and is going to be better placed to speak to some of these issues. I think one thing I want to highlight here is the absconding charge, which is part of the Kafala system. It means you can't leave if you leave your employer without permission, they can raise a criminal complaint against you. That plays an important role in dissuading women from complaining. Women can complain to the Public Administration for Manpower, but many may not do so because of the risk of being charged with absconding. And the government has acknowledged, that there are high numbers of false claims of absconding made, and in fact, during the pandemic, even stopped accepting complaints for it. I'm going to move on to Qatar now. Finally, of our three countries, Qatar has been under the spotlight, as many of you will know, for the treatment of migrant workers for a long period now, for about 10 years, because of it has the World Cup, which has put a spotlight on the country. In the last 3 to 4 years, it has clearly been engaged in a reform program. So when we look at good practices, a lot of these are coming, around and in this reform program that it's doing in partnership with the ILO. On fair recruitment itself, the most significant efforts we've seen by Qatar have been around contract substitution, and the Qatar visa centers, which have been established in many key origin states. They are not without criticism, and we'll come on to some of that, particularly around recruitment fees. But it is clear that workers are getting the chance to see their contracts at the visa center and to understand the terms and conditions that they will be going into. Whether they have the ability to change their mind if they don't like those contracts, if they have been deceived, is another question. But they are at least being able to see them and understand what they're going into. The other thing I want to highlight is, high-profile initiatives that are not government initiatives per se, but big clients for projects in Qatar have put recruitment, given it priority. And the Supreme Committee, which is organizing the World Cup, is the most notable. It has a scheme that involves repayment of recruitment fees to workers. And Ray may speak about this later. And of course, we can't not mention the fact that there's been a significant reform to Qatar's Kafala system in 2020, giving workers, considerably more job mobility under the law. Implementation is a question, and I'll briefly touch on that. But the legal change itself is significant. Turning to some of the challenges, recruitment fees is an area where it's not clear that there's been a huge degree of progress. Qatari law does prohibit payment of fees by workers, but it doesn't say much about what happens if the worker pays before they get to Qatar to an agent in their own country, which is clearly how most workers pay fees. And we're seeing that in practice, even workers going through the Qatar visa centers are mostly paying fees around the side. The visa centers have put a focus on contract substitution, not so much on the payment of fees. And I think going back to Anurag mentioned this issue of demand, the demand issue. The demand continues to be for a worker pays model, and there is not enough scrutiny by the authorities of how employers interact with recruiters. Do they pay the appropriate fees to a recruitment agent? Do they even demand kickbacks, sort of payments in exchange for jobs? We see limited scrutiny of these issues by, for example, labor inspectors and law enforcement officials. And I think it's worth saying that these big flagship projects that are taking an interest in recruitment fees, they cover a relatively small proportion of the workers in Qatar. And outside the big flagship projects, it's clear that there's still an expectation among employers that workers will pay. And I just highlighted one quote we had from one Qatari businessman who said, look, it comes down to money. We want the cheapest access to workers. And that's why one of our recommendations is that companies should be required under public procurement procedures to actually bid transparently for fair recruitment costs in contract tenders for big public projects, and that should apply through their contracting chain. Last slide before I sort of hand back to Rima. I think it's just worth taking a look at what is the employment context workers are recruited into in Qatar, because this is what the reform program has really been trying to tackle. We mentioned job mobility. There has been some improvements in the law. We still see evidence that workers are experiencing barriers in practice to moving job. That should say barriers in practice on the slide. The absconding charge remains in place despite some hints by the government that it would be got rid of. So Kafala reform is not a done deal. It's not finished. It has started, and that's encouraging, but it has to be followed through with implementation and further reform. Some progress on the issue of worker voice and freedom of association. We have 20 or more companies now who can join these special joint committees. It's not full freedom of association, but it is it is a step forward. Outside those big companies, so the majority of workers in smaller companies still lack any form of worker representation. So that's and that's an important thing to stress. Clearly freedom of association and worker organization really helps with fair recruitment. And then finally, there've been a number of efforts to improve the labor complaints system, and a number of steps have been taken to speed things up, to put in place a fund so that workers can be repaid. We still see these cases though taking a very long time for workers to actually be able to get their money, and a key recommendation is really Qatar should look at how to speed up those rulings, and one of the ways they could do that is to allow workers to bring cases throughout the process collectively, where the details of their cases are very, very similar, rather than splitting them up into many, many individual cases. I'm going to hand over to Rima. Sorry, I think I've overdone my time.
Just a bit, it's okay. Thank you, James and Anurag, for sharing the insights and recommendations from your important research. I think we're going to go straight to the rest of the panelists to react and expand upon the points that you have made. And we will start with Dr. Ray Gioradini, who is a professor of migration ethics and human rights at the Center for Islamic Legislation and Ethics, which is part of the College of Islamic Studies at Hamad bin Khalifa University in Doha, Qatar. Among many publications on labor migration, he was one of the authors of the Qatar Foundation's Mandatory Standards for Migrant Worker Welfare in 2013, as well as the first in-depth study of migrant labor recruitment to Qatar published in 2014. So Dr. Ray, I know you have a lot to share from your work on recruitment and in Qatar, so the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Rima, and thank you, James, also. And thanks for this invitation to talk to this issue, which has been one of my primary areas of concern for some years. I will speak slowly, but if my connection breaks up, please let me know immediately. I want to start with the need to understand that there is a system of labor recruitment, and that this system has led to the ongoing concerns about worker payments. And I want to emphasize that there are three levels or arenas or markets, if you like, of competition, which together in migrant labor recruitment to the Gulf states and other countries. The three areas of competition are, firstly, where companies are tendering for a project contract in the destination country. That is precisely begins there when a project, and they have to compete with one another in order to get the project contract. The second is the competition between recruitment agencies who are vying for the labor supply contract from the employer in the destination country, or the labor demand letters. they need to compete as well. And then the third level of competition is between workers themselves, migrant workers or prospective migrant workers. In the origin.
Dr. Ray, we are starting to lose you a bit. Perhaps you could try turning off your video.
So you might want to think about this as CAM, migrant workers. Now, a project where they are that is where there may be a policy that the lowest bidder gets the contract. Hello? I think you lost. Hello?
Hi,
can you
Dr.
hear
Ray,
me?
we can hear you. Yeah, we can hear you now. Perhaps if you continue without your video, it might be a bit clearer.
Yes, I will do that. I'm sorry about this. It's
No
a
problem.
bad connection for me. Right. So in other words, the competition for a project by corporations means that they want to keep their bids low. One of the ways in doing that is to not to pay for the recruitment costs and to assume that the workers themselves are going to pay the recruitment costs. And of course, as James mentioned, the issue of kickback payments to employees of the employing company is a very standard procedure. So there is an incentive for these kickback, whether you call them bribes or extortion or exaction. I can discuss those different terms later if necessary. So there's not enough transparency in the tendering process for worker recruitment costs, as James mentioned. And this is one of the recommendations, is to make sure there is a transparent, at least estimation of the costs of labor in the tendering process, right? This should really already be happening because in Qatar, for example, most tenders are receiving the migrant worker welfare standards even in the pre-tender stage. And there's not enough transparency about that process. But as far as I know, there's no explicit requirement for the estimation of labor costs in tendering. From the recruitment agency competition, agencies must comply with the requirements of employers to obtain and maintain their recruitment business. And as has been found in the report, these are the complaints to say, and in my research many years ago, all agencies that I interviewed said, look, we don't want to charge workers, but we need to do so because otherwise we won't get the contracts to supply the labor. One of the questions, and they must offer the kickback payments to the employers. And one of the questions that we should also ask here is, who is the client of the recruitment agent? Is it the employer, or is it the worker, or is it both? And we need to understand and regulate and standardize that in order to understand the expectations of workers paying as well as employers paying. And as mentioned previously, the Qatar visa centers are not designed at all to stop worker recruitment charges and payments. And the third element of competition is between workers. They must compete with one another for the limited supply of jobs. And despite the free ticket, free visa campaign in Nepal in 2015, workers are still paying, as Anurag pointed out. So, as I've argued before, there is a culture here. It is a culture of corruption, a culture of paying. Workers in Nepal expect to pay for the jobs that they get. It is a ritualized process. They may know and understand that they should not be paying, but they simply, well, from my interviews, they simply say, I know I shouldn't have paid, but I needed to get the job. And that was a condition of getting the job, is to pay what was being charged. And we also know that some workers expect that the more money they pay, the better service or the better job they're going to get. It's not true, but there is this expectation. And even if the employer pays all the recruitment costs, that does not mean that the agency cannot still charge workers for their recruitment. So what I'm arguing here is that the challenge is to address all of these areas, these three areas, all together at the same time. The international push for an employer pays model of recruitment is important. But we need to be clear that it must be employer only pays, because until the culture and expectation of paying for jobs is overcome, workers can still pay. The other thing, okay, the last point to make here is that the defense of agencies and of the employers is that we're happy to be ethical and to do ethical recruitment as long as it is a level playing field. And so within the context of this competition, we need to understand that this level playing field must be addressed. Because in other words, if we are acting ethically and my competitor is not, they are going to be at a competitive advantage over us, and therefore they won't do anything. The recruitment reimbursement that the Supreme Committee for Delivery and Legacy for the World Cup in Qatar is getting their companies to reimburse workers for the money that they paid. And that is a brilliant process whereby the company is required to show in their accounts that they have paid the recruitment fees. And if they can't show that, they have to reimburse the workers. But that's not a solution. That's only an interim measure, because the real objective is to eliminate workers being charged. So the challenge is to tackle all three elements: the employers paying recruitment costs, agencies not charging workers, and workers not paying. And I'll leave it there. I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ray. Your contributions always have a really important level of detail, and I'm sure we'll have a lot of follow-up questions. For now, we will move on to our next panelist, who is Anne Abunda, who is a former domestic worker and is now the head volunteer and founding chairperson of Stand Again Kuwait, a group which is advocating and empowering marginalized workers by organizing and providing opportunities to strengthen their skills, including launching programs in line with the current situation in their host country. And you and your team work so closely with migrant workers from many nationalities. Could you share your reflections both from Kuwait and from the domestic worker sector?
Hello, good day to everyone. Good day to everyone. So I am going to talk about the recruitment and employment dynamics in Kuwait. There are two types of recruitment and employment in Kuwait. We have the local hire and from country of origin. So local hire mostly for 18 visa or skilled workers. There are also cases of local hire in the domestic worker sector, but they call it transfer or release because of the Kafala system. From country of origin, only the diplomats can hire directly. In the case of the Philippines, for example, They can submit document of legal age, able Filipino citizen, and pass the health screening requirements to the Philippine Embassy. We have the name hire and regular recruitment through recruitment agency. Processing, inspection, and approval of job order, 2 years contract with insurance, health, accidents, and it includes repatriation costs. They have also undertaking both agencies, Philippine agencies and Kuwait agencies, and employer for the protection of the workers. In the case of African nationals, there is no protection system yet on various embassy on regulating job orders except Sierra Leone and Ethiopia. The worker can travel if they receive visa in various neighboring countries if their respective countries have laws or immigration rules that hinders them to come to work in Kuwait. For example, in the case of Burundi, domestic workers, they need to travel to Uganda, and from Uganda to Kenya, and from Kenya, they will fly to Kuwait, which puts them in a very vulnerable situation. Government-to-government recruitment do exist in case of Bhutan and Bangladesh. For Bangladesh, military services or work. For Bhutan, non-domestic worker. We are working closely, especially with Bhutan Embassy or Consulate with regards to their labor cases. With regards to trafficking in person, Kuwait passed human trafficking law in 2013 and domestic workers law in 2015. They also create government women's shelter to house victims of human trafficking and forced labor. The executive body that implements domestic workers law, including the management of the government women's shelter, is now under Ministry of Labor, Labor's Public Authority for Manpower. The Domestic and Recruitment Office that litigates or mediates issues between employer, recruitment agency, and domestic worker is being heard only in a single office in Romania. So I need to emphasize that out of 680,000 more or less domestic workers, there is only one office to cater them in case they encounter labor problem, which is commendable. But of course, implementation is another story. Not all in the domestic workers law is being implemented. Access to justice is not impossible, but very, very challenging on the part of domestic worker. Again, I will emphasize, out of 680,000 more or less domestic workers, there's only one office that caters them in case of labor problem. And majority of the workers doesn't know the process of lodging complaints or even the actual place itself. Out of 680,000 domestic workers, more or less, there are only 5 labor inspectors that handles them. Since they are not aware on how to access to justice, their option is to run away, which is against the law. In the same year, they trying to create a mega recruitment agency, but later time, it was built in public-private partnership type, which is now the Aldura. Their aim is to lower the recruitment cost and to combat illegal recruitment. Despite of this significant effort, Kafala placed bigger hindrance to the implementation of the law to realize their mandated goal. Absconding or run away in violation of immigration rule is criminal in nature, place bigger wall on prosecution and implementation of the said improvement to combat trafficking in person. Once the employer filed absconding case against the worker cannot file anymore. There are also other hindrances like the conflicting laws, for example, the privacy law in Kuwait against the mandate of the labor inspectors, definition of terms, like the definition of human trafficking. For us, we call it human trafficking if a worker is being transferred to another employer against the will of the worker. But in Kuwait, it's normal. They call it transfer or release of workers. Freedom of association is not permitted in Kuwait. It's illegal. Lack of training for law implementers, like gender sensitivity training, considering the fact that most of the abuse complainants are domestic workers, they are women. It is changing and improving somehow, but there are a lot of things need to be done in order to attain the goal of protecting the domestic worker or migrant workers in general in Kuwait. Again, just access to justice is not impossible, but very, very challenging. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anne. You know these issues so intimately, so it's always wonderful to hear your insights. We're going to move to our last panelist, Kamud Kanal, who is the former vice president of the Nepal Association of Foreign Employment Agencies. He is also now the chairman of EPAN, the Ethics Practitioners Association of Nepal, and the managing director of Fusion International. He has been involved in the recruitment sector for 20 years. So Kamud, I know you have really fascinating insights into the perspectives of recruiters and also issues generally within Nepal. The floor is yours to respond to the report and to everything that we've been hearing from the speakers so far.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, hi to everybody. I'm from Ethical Practitioner Association of Nepal. Means like we formed this association in 2017, taking initiative of fair recruiting. That means zero cost for the migrant workers. No workers should pay for any recruitment process. This is what our aim is. And for this, we need to understand that like what are the procedure and what are the costs for the migrant workers involved to get the foreign employment. And like in the presence also, I've seen all that, like in Nepal, we need to understand we have three kind of foreign employment going on. One is individual, where there is no control of cost, means like anybody abroad can send visa to the migrant workers and they process. And there is another sent by government, where all the Nepal side cost, including the airfare, is borne by the migrant workers. And third process is from the private sector, where there are various laws which control the cost cutting for the migrant workers. But it's still in paper there is, but government is not, government cannot control all the things. Because of this, we are practicing three kinds of things. Like first, we need to understand that for the migrant workers, there are several costs which migrant workers has to invest in Nepal side before going to abroad. Like let's say there is insurance, visa charge, promotion board cost, and then medical, passport, transportation, all that. Like what we find is when like from IBAN side, when we go to destination side to promote the ethical recruiting process, the employer, they are less interested to pay the amount which migrant workers has to pay in Nepal side. They are not willing to pay that one. And then another thing, they prefer to use the middleman instead of coming directly to the recruiting agencies. And another thing, like there is a like you can say for us, I'm talking from Nepal side, like we have like discriminate from like let's say from country to country, especially in Qatar, or you can say in Kuwait, Nepalese migrant workers are paid less than the other countries. So this is also a problem we are facing. And then and another thing is like in Nepal side, Nepal government has imposed a minimum wages salary for each and every country. But whereas in destination side, there is no such kind of provision. So there is a mismatch of agreement going on that side also. And then another thing is like we did campaign from 2017 for ethical recruitment, but I'm really sad to say that none of the employer are interested to bear the cost that occurs in Nepal side. That is the hard fact to us. Whereas there are a lot of good laws and new policies coming out through the Nepal government also, like MOU and all that. But when we go to it, we don't see how to monitor that one, and we don't see whether the migrant workers are really getting into the as per the MOU signed by two governments. That is also one problem we are facing. And another problem, like mostly we're facing, is our competitor from other countries like Bangladesh, India, and others country also. Like we don't have the similar kind of laws to supply the migrant workers. That's what we are lacking in that side. And yeah, there are several good policies come out by Nepal government, like embassy attestation and then all the complaint way to receive and all that. There are several things which Anurag also elaborated before also. But from our angle, what I see is migrant workers, they are not access to that point. Even the recruiter agencies, they are not access to that point. It's only in the paper. So sad to say. And then now, what we are feeling, especially Ethical Practitioner Association, our friends are feeling that it's good to hear that migrant workers shouldn't pay any amount and all that when we do the campaign, but lack of less interest by the employer and all that, this is very hard to sustain, but it's good to say what to say. I have no words to say about that, since we have been campaigning on that, but we are not succeeding. Let's see what will be in the future. Our suggestion is government in Nepal should promote such kind of agencies. We have quite clear and transparent policies to recruit the migrant workers. We did try with the employer, they just don't want to bear the cost for Nepal side, which is from our side, we feel it's unethical and we leave the demand. That's what's happening. So it's really complicated. So what to say? And then regarding this, recently this Qatar Visa Center also, at least it's a good initiative taken by the Qatar government side. At least migrant workers can see their agreements and their how much salary or what sort of job they are going to see on that. But beside that, it doesn't control about the cost, how much they are paying and all that. That's one question. And it's too early to say that Qatar, for the Qatar Foundation, whether it's a failure or they are on the right track. We need to watch for another few times, then only we can come out with that. But so far, recently also, we see lots of advertisement coming from Qatar side also. Even some of the government quota are coming, but it's all recruited through unethical way, meaning workers has to pay the airfare, all the cost which occurs here in Nepal. So we try to approach to the employer, but we are failing on that. They are not responding and all that. That's what happening. So these are the things what we found on that. Anything in questions, if anybody would like to come, I would be happy to answer on that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kamud. We have just about 15 minutes left, and I know our Q&A section has been very active. Quite a few questions have already been answered. I will read out a couple of them though. So the first one is from Tachi. It's a question for Sandigan. What are your recommendations for what needs to be done to strengthen access to justice for migrant domestic workers in Kuwait? We know the challenges, but what can be done to address these challenges? Anne?
Yes. It will first come. There must be a changes not only in the country of destination, but also in the country of origin. So we are attending a lot of trainings regarding that, and we are submitting a lot of recommendations regarding that needs to be changed in our country. For example, the policies, the recruitment process itself. But here in Kuwait, for example, implementers should need to have training, especially with the gender sensitivities, and they need to add more labor inspectors, more women in the police stations to handle cases for domestic workers. Of course, Kafala. We need to remove Kafala. We need to remove Kafala. Thank you.
Thanks, Anne. And actually, I have a follow-up question, which I'll just pose to all of the panelists, which is a little bit specific to domestic work, and sort of touches upon Ray raised about sort of this culture of expectation regarding recruitment payments. And that's that, you know, in Kuwait and in Qatar and in much of the Gulf, the very high cost of recruitment lends to this perception amongst employers that they own the domestic worker. And so while it's, of course, very important that we support this employer's pay principle, how do you see overcoming the obstacles that we're facing from this backlash from employers?
Can I say something just very briefly to this? I think that there needs to be a campaign to address the relationship between the employer of a domestic worker and the agency. And I think that there is a tremendous resentment about the amount that the employers are actually paying.
I think we're losing you, Dr. Ray.
There should be a proper analysis of the actual cost of recruit. What employers are paying often is far. The principle is to actual financial cost.
Dr. Ray, I think we're losing you. Maybe you could write your response in the chat box.
I will. Okay.
All right, thank you so much. I don't know if anybody else wants to chime in. If not, okay, James, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say that I think we see this narrative in many of the corridors we've looked at, that sometimes there's a sense in which the employer pays principle is seen as being somehow incompatible with having more job mobility, with having and with, you know, as Anne says, with properly reforming systems like Kafala or tied visa systems. The sense that, okay, if I'm an employer and if I have to pay all the workers' costs, then I must have the right to their services for some, you know, some specified amount of time. And I think we have to take that head on, that actually that it is not the case that these two things have to be mutually incompatible. Migrant workers shouldn't have to choose between having some job freedom or, you know, whether they pay for their costs. They should be able to travel for a job without paying the cost of that. And then they should have some freedom to switch jobs if that job is, you know, is not decent, or if there are other jobs that are, you know, offering for their skills, you know, better conditions and terms. That is something that professionals expect and get when they work. So why should it be any different, you know, when it is people at, you know, lower income levels? So I think that is an assumption that needs to be tackled head on. If you as an employer pay for someone's recruitment fees and then they come to work for you and they want to move immediately to another job, that begs the question of why is that? Are you paying them properly? Are you giving them decent conditions? Because if you are, probably workers won't want to do that. You know, generally people are keen to succeed in the job that they've applied for. I don't know if Anne has any additional comments on that.
Yeah, for us, high recruitment costs will of course add to the burden of the workers. Definitely yes, because of a high cost converts to excessive workloads. It converts to maltreatment, not giving of day off, restriction of movement because maybe they will run away. That's the mentality of the employer, and they will lose the money they spend. It also added difficulty on the supply of domestic workers, especially now that you know, pandemic, and transfer of worker to another employer in exchange of money. That's one of the biggest problem here. Even if they already finished their contract, again they still need to pay for the transfer, which we are talking about like 1,500 KD. So, and it always leads to abuses and leads to visa trading, which is also a big problem here. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne. Thank you, James. Q&A box for a question from Cindy from OSF, which is, can you share information about efforts to collectively organize and represent migrant workers with employers to improve terms and conditions of work, or raising grievances for groups of workers? Where and how has this been done? Can you talk about organizing some workers prior to departure and links with unions and countries of destination? So this question isn't for anyone specifically, so anyone from the panel, please feel free to jump in.
I mean, I guess I have to say, in our research we haven't got many examples of that, unfortunately, because even where there is, in Qatar we have some very initial moves towards these joint committees. That doesn't allow for example, at the moment, any kind of collective bargaining. These are joint committees as well between companies and workers. So we're not at that stage yet. I mean, we have active unions in Nepal who play a role in supporting and advocating for workers. We have worker networks that exist. Anne will be better placed to talk about the situation in Kuwait, but I guess what I would briefly say is, I think we expected at the beginning of our research to find a more positive picture on the union side in Kuwait, because clearly, there is a Kuwait Trade Union Federation. However, the ITUC classifies Kuwait as a country with no freedom of no trade union rights. And that's because the trade unions are very closely controlled, and there are heavy restrictions on who can join, including migrant workers. So the reality, it does not look as positive as sometimes presented.
Yes, you're right, James. Actually, here in Kuwait, freedom of association is still illegal here in Kuwait. So what we are planning is to have, like for the Filipino domestic workers, we need to have a transnational union for domestic workers before leaving the country. So they will be part of the union even before leaving the country, Kuwait, Philippines. So that will, make some difference for the situation of the domestic workers, especially if they are already bombarded or they know already the rights, how to access justice, and know the people whom they will contact to in case of trouble or problem arise in the country of destination. So transnational union is one of the big plan that we have.
Thank you both. We'll go to another question from the Q&A, which is from Andrew Hall. It is a question and a statement at the same time. I believe it's just been, Dr. Ray has just answered it. Excuse me one second. So my opinion is that ethical recruitment market change can only succeed if we look at this issue from a business human rights perspective. There's enough involvement of multinational companies subject to a plethora of modern slavery and business and human rights sustainability legislation, and involved in unethical recruitment to use this lens to ensure practical pilot projects involving them to really kickstart an ethical recruitment market now. Agree. I think, James, you wanted to tackle this one?
Yeah, definitely. I think that's a really important point. I think the business and human rights lens is really important here. And I think, in a sense, and Andy obviously does, incredibly important work shining the spotlight on, major companies who are, as yet not doing the work that they need to do to ensure fair and ethical recruitment in their supply chains, and in some cases, in the case of their direct employees. And it is true that if we can get big multinationals to really show the way on this, that will play a very important role. I think where we see our role as complementary here within the business and human rights framework is where you have the responsibilities of business in kind of pillar 2 of the UN guiding principles on business and human rights. The responsibility of governments in pillar 1, to regulate those businesses, we think is really, really important. Partly because so much of the market in, for example, the Gulf is actually dominated by actors outside those big, big international companies that may be susceptible to that kind of pressure. So in a sense, we think that those are complementary efforts, and that, you know, and Ray mentioned this idea of the level playing field, something so that, you know, the governments are providing some layer of scrutiny and pressure on employers. The more they can do that. And I think we particularly, that's one of the reasons, going back to my early statement, why we are focusing on destination states as part of the 5 Corridors project. Those are the countries that have, you know, the most or the least excuse to not have, you know, adequate capacity in their enforcement and inspection regimes, you know, not to have the right legislation in place. There's no excuse. These are the, you know, some of the wealthiest states in the world that we've looked at in the 5 Corridors. And they ought to have the right, you know, regimes in and Anne's example for, you know, around the number of people actually working on the protection of domestic workers in Kuwait, I think is extremely telling. You know, there's 750,000 domestic workers in Kuwait, and one tiny office charged with dealing with complaints about their conditions, and that, you know, frankly, for a country as wealthy and advanced as Kuwait is not acceptable, and that's kind of where we need to see a really ramping up of efforts.
I have a query.
Thanks,
Can I ask?
Please.
Can I ask? I have a queries. Okay, let's say.
Please go ahead, Kumar.
Yeah, in Nepal there are some recruiters like who take the demand for unethical way, also like charging with the migrant workers, and to some employers they send as per the agreement, let's say not exactly all free, like 0 cost, like they charge here. So can we call that kind of recruiters as ethical recruiters? You got my point or not? In Nepal,
so I see. So this is sort of halfway. I mean, I think we you know, we come from the position that international standards are, you know, international standards are now, the now agreement is that the worker shouldn't pay. Clearly, from a worker's perspective, it's likely to be better if what you pay is less, you know, and we saw some sort of suggestions that perhaps the free ticket, free visa policy has slightly reduced the amount that people pay on average. Though I think not significantly enough to declare that policy a success. I think, you know, going to your point there, yeah, does that mean that they're ethical? I mean, we have to work to a basis where it is an employer pays model. I think one final thing I'd like to say on the Nepal side is, you know, we talked about this issue of competition, you know, that it is highly competitive environment where agents are competing with each other within Nepal, but they're also competing with other origin states. And so what we are asking, you know, Nepal to do to fully abolish fees, you know, is clearly a challenging ask in some ways, because other origin states don't ban fees. So that could make Nepali workers seem less competitive. I think the first point is, you know, that's why we're saying destination states have got to provide that, and companies have got to provide that market for ethical recruitment. But also origin states should work together much better than they currently do. And that's something the Nepali government themselves have actually, you know, said very clearly in their kind of report from 2020 on migration, that we've got to work through the Colombo process and other models to move together on these issues.
Yeah, I raised this question because, well, you know, I have encountered with 2-3 company in Gulf. Like we have given them, we are quite transparent, like what will be the cost for the migrant workers, each migrant workers. We have given all the details. But other agency in Nepal, they shortcut the things and they sum up the amount. Means like they reduce the cost of migrant workers. They somehow put little bit to the migrant workers, and somehow they take it from the employer, and they took the demand. This is what we are facing also. Like we are quite transparent, we are giving all the details, but other agency are cutting that cost, and then we're not being able to place the job. That's what I'm talking about. So that is the problem we are facing. Let's say we have a policy that including passport, transportation, all the cost which is occurring in Nepal, employers should pay. We have given all the step, like how and when the migrant workers invest the amount. So we have demand with the employer to pay that one to the migrant workers. But in regarding with that, like our competitor, they cost They cut that cost and they just focus on service charge. Okay, you need not to pay other costs. You just need to pay service charge. Will supply the workers. This is what we are facing the problem. That's why I asked you this question.
Thank you, Kamud. I think we're running up against time, and I just want to give all of the panelists a last opportunity for final comments and reflections. One thing that we haven't really discussed, and so feel free to touch upon it in your final reflections if you would like, is the impact of COVID-19 on the recruitment industry has obviously been significant. And what does that mean for recruitment reform going forward? I think we can start with Anurag, if that's okay.
Hi, yeah. Am I audible?
Yes.
Yeah. Yes, I have to admit that COVID-19 has been an eye-opener in many sense. But if I have to speak wearing the hat of the researcher, it had been a very arduous work because especially when we wanted to ask questions about the fair recruitment, all we were receiving is what they had to go through because of the COVID-19 in the destination countries. So it was a really a challenge because we had to we were talking with the workers who didn't had their sufficient amount of the food, and they were kicked off from their company. And there were cases of wage thefts where they wanted us to assist them with the relief assistance of any sorts. Uh, and 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 i- and if I have to speak from a lawyer's perspective, we've received a lot of complaints on uh, particularly on the rights of migrant workers, which came out very loud and very clear, especially on the wake of pandemic, as the domestic laws of Nepal did not even realize the right to return as a fundamental right of the migrant workers. So in light with that, uh, we have to acknowledge the decision of the Supreme Court of Nepal, even if there were no domestic laws and policy that reiterated the return as the right of migrant workers. The Supreme Court did stood up and acknowledged right to return as a fundamental right, and there was a directive order which kind of guaranteed the right to return, which kind of helped them come back. But there are still lots of challenges which we really need to work on in the domestic level. For instance, we have not even envisioned the epidemics or pandemic related measures in the foreign employment laws, which is very specific, and we are yet to envision that in the bilateral agreements, because the recent bilateral agreement signed after 2017 does protect, it does cover a good good amount of the rights. But if we try to pick specific pandemic related measures in the bilateral agreements, we don't have any answers to that. So there's been lot of learnings from the pandemic. So I hope we get to work on that and make ourselves prepare for such incidents in the future.
Thank you, Anurag. I'll move on to Dr. Ray. If there are any last comments you would like to make.
Yes, I will try. Can you hear me okay?
It's breaking up a bit
okay.
now, actually.
Okay. So I just wanted to make a philosophical point to finish with, because much of the opposition to what we are advocating here is to do with markets, and the idea that the markets that I have detailed, the 3 markets, which now James, of course, thankfully added the international labor market competition. These are often treated as markets, and that should not be interfered with based upon, economic ideological models that I can't go into right now. But the idea of not interfering in markets is something that also needs to be challenged at the governmental levels and elsewhere, that these markets are inherently corrupt. And so something has to be done with them. They have to be regulated. We have to intervene and moralize these markets for ethical recruitment, not to believe in the idea that the so-called market forces of supply and demand will adjust everything. It's not the case. So that's the final point I would like to make.
Thank you, Dr. An excellent point to end on. Karen, if you have any final remarks in just under a minute, that would be great. Kamid, are you still with us? Okay, let's move on to Anne then. If there are any final reflections you would like to make, Anne.
Yes. Now they are now starting the recruitment process again. After being stuck for like 2 years, like in the case of the Philippines and Kuwait. I hope they took that opportunity to have some reforms in the recruitment process, especially in the protection of the domestic workers and migrant workers in general. We see a lot of lack of reintegration program in the country of origin, especially. For me, it's like creating more programs in deploying workers, but not on the side of what will happen if they return back home. So that's what happened during the pandemic. A lot of workers went home because of they lost their job. And also with the bilateral agreements and MOUs between 2 countries, they should involve the CSOs because we know the problem. We need to be there, especially in the consultation process. We need to have a say, especially in the recommendation, doing the recommendations and in what is good for us. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Anne. And finally, James, I'll also ask you to let everybody know again where they can find this report and any final reflections on your end.
Thank you so much, Rima, and all the other panelists. It's been a really great discussion, and it's been really great to see the active discussion in the chat boxes and Q&A as well. So thanks so much for that. Yes, so 5corridorsproject.org is where you can find the reports, and that's also you'll also see there is quite a chunk of material in Nepali and Arabic, and in fact we'll be adding more in both of those languages in the coming days. I guess my final comment just on the COVID point. There is actually, if in our key recommendations report, we have a short section on COVID-19 and its impact on fair recruitment. I think one of the things that the ILO itself has raised as being a kind of grave concern is that the fact that the labor markets in many destination countries have contracted quite significantly is going to drive up costs. We're seeing that already in Nepal, and other barriers have also been placed in the way of people migrating, which again will drive up costs. It's now much more difficult to travel. There are therefore costs attached to that. So I think those are really kind of serious concerns. I think more broadly, what we saw when we looked across our 5 corridors and saw, well, what happened with COVID? You saw this sort of kind of quite a different picture, which is on the one hand, several destination country societies and origin state societies attained a greater appreciation for migrant workers. We saw the migrant workers being seen as heroes, essential workers, key workers. And from the origin state, sometimes, presidents kind of getting up and saying, these are heroes, bringing remittances back into our country. this is what we need at this time of economic crisis. But on the other hand, you know, as so often happens, you saw a kind of demonization effect, you know, in Kuwait, in Thailand, in Taiwan. You've seen migrants in many cases treated as if they are the source of the problem. In Qatar, for example, we saw reports of workers being kind of rounded up and deported, you know, seemingly at random in the early days of the thing. Kuwait's been it's been really serious for migrant workers ever since the pandemic started. So I think we have these two competing processes at work, and I guess, you know, that time will tell whether we do intend to kind of build back with a more I guess appreciative approach of what migrant workers bring to, you know, economies and societies worldwide. So anyway, thank you so much, Rima, and to everyone else.
Thank you, James, and thank you all of the panelists for, you know, shedding light on what's often seen as a very intractable issue and elucidating the kind of overlapping streams of accountability between origin and destination states when it comes to recruitment. And thank you to all of our attendees for staying with us over time. We will be sending a follow-up email with all of the links to the reports that we have mentioned. If you have any further questions, I'm sure all of our panelists would be happy to reach out to you. So yeah, thank you so much for joining us, and I think we'll close there.